Okay, we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Charles Sims. I'm the director of the Energy and Environment program here at the Baker Center. We're thrilled to co-host this event with the Institute for Secure and Sustainable Environment, one of, we hope, many collaborations in the future to bring together great energy policy speakers to campus. So a couple of housekeeping items first and foremost. If you are online, you should see a link at the bottom of your screen that'll pop up periodically that will take you to a place where you can submit questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. We'll collect those and then feed those into the Q&A at the end. So if you're watching online, we still want you to participate, enter your questions there. Also, if you're looking online and you're just seeing me talking, you can toggle your device and you can see the presentations, the slides that will be popping up as the presentation goes on. So if you're in the presentation and you're thinking all I see is the middle of the auditorium, there should be a way to toggle the view to look at another camera that will show the slides. Okay. If, for folks that are here, if they're interested in these types of policy discussions, please sign up for the Baker Center mailing list. We have lots of these. We have an Energy and Environment Forum that goes on every semester where we bring in speakers from across the country to talk about energy and environmental policy issues. So if you like what you see today, sign up for the mailing list and we can send you more information about speakers that we have that are very similar to what we're talking about today. If you are a graduate student and you're interested in the topics that we are talking about today, I would encourage you to sign up for it's essentially a reading group that goes along with our seminar series here at the Baker Center. We have some people in the audience who are part of the reading group this semester. It is essentially a book club, right? We take a journal article from different perspectives and we have the students read and discuss it. So we spend a lot of time in graduate school getting accustomed to how we think and how we talk about a disciplinary perspective, or from a disciplinary perspective, about an energy and environmental issue. And then by the time we get done, we're expected to intermingle with other people. This is giving you an experience and some opportunity to talk to other people about an energy and environmental policy issue that might not think the same way you do. Okay? And you'll be required to do that as you move into the real world. So this is a good experience. The topics of the reading group will be dependent on who's in the class. So if you're worried that you're going to sign up for a class and it may not cover a topic you're interested in, you get to choose that. This is a bit of a choose your own adventure. So if you're interested in that, contact me, Dr. Charles Sims at the Baker Center, and I can get you signed up for that reading group list. Okay. Once again, I wanted to thank the Institute for Secure and Sustainable Environment for helping us co-host this event today. And I'm going to hand it over to Chen-Fei Chen to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Charles. My name is Chen-Fei Chen. I'm the new Director of Energy and Environmental Justice at ICE at UTK. And today is my honor to introduce our special speaker, Professor Benjamin Sovacool from Boston University. He told me not to give a long list of introduction of himself. Otherwise, it will take up probably 45 minutes just to introduce him. So he is energy justice and policy climate change scholar and very well known in the entire planet. And if you are interested reading more of his article, you can read 500 articles about his work. Okay, today I'm going to just give it to microphone to Benjamin to tell us this new research he is leading, and lots of new data and coming from interdisciplinary perspective. Thank you.
What a wonderful and brief introduction, Dr. Chen. Thank you very much. It's really nice to be here. I am at Boston University, but also Aarhus University, which is in Denmark. And this research is funded by the European Research Council. And the project stands for GENIE, and that was very intentional, the genie in the bottle. But it also stands for kind of governance, geoengineering, and negative emissions pathways in Europe. And it's a very weird grant. It's what's called a synergy grant. These grants are very competitive. We probably shouldn't have gone in for it, Dr. Chen. Chances are 1%, but it's for 6 years. And the idea is it has to address a social challenge. It has to be high-risk research, and it has to involve deep interdisciplinarity that doesn't normally happen. And I'm really privileged to kind of provide that deep interdisciplinarity across at least disciplines, not necessarily genders, as you see here. But I do qualitative social science work. My colleague, Kaywan Riahi, who is a co-PI, does integrated assessment modeling. Yan does quantitative evidence synthesis, machine learning, and topic modeling. And finally, Greg does kind of innovation policy, history, and transition studies. So it's a great place where we actually have 6 years to couple modeling, social science, evidence synthesis, history, and case studies together. I also have to say that a lot of what I'm going to present isn't just my own. I'm supported by a phenomenal team of postdocs. Charles, they might be looking for a job in a year or two. I'll direct them to you. And you can see it's, Dr. Sean Lowe, Dr. Livia Fritz, and Dr. Chad Baum all work far more than they should on the project. And you'll see many of the publications that I present have them as first authors, which means they truly did lead the research. All right, with those formalities out of the way, I really wanted to focus just on 4 dimensions to the project. And I figured I should start. I know I've got some general energy efficiency and transportation and agent-based modeling people with the more existential question, why in the world would you want to study geoengineering? And maybe for some of the students, what the heck is it? What is geoengineering? So the term that we use is here. It's right there in the middle. It's a broad set of methods or technologies or techniques that deliberately alter the climate system to stop climate change. It's fundamentally different than mitigation, which is stopping emissions with solar panels and electric vehicles and land use practices. It's very different than adaptation, which is building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And it usually includes the rest of this table, techniques called greenhouse gas removal or carbon removal or solar radiation management. These options are incredibly risky. I've kind of told my students there are a plan C and a plan D, right? Plan A is mitigation, plan B is adaptation. If those don't work, we maybe break the glass and use these options. But the narrative for why we might need these options is surprisingly persuasive and perhaps even a little bit scary. For instance, these 2 maps show you, in terms of actual ppm of carbon in the atmosphere, as well as temperature change, how well our intergovernmental process maps with global change. It's not a positive relationship. Despite the fact that we have had 50 years of knowledge about climate change, emissions are going up and up and up, and the atmosphere is getting more toxic. And on the right, despite the fact that we've had this consultation of the parties process within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, right, for almost as long as Chen Fei has been born, 1995, you can see, again, temperature changes are going up already. And if any of you looked up the most recent IPCC report, that's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, here is the headline graph from the Summary for Policymakers from their synthesis report. Do you see between C7 and C8, that top red line, which is the median? We now have a 50% or greater chance of exceeding a 4-degree temperature change. So it is more likely than not that we will see not a 1-degree change or a 2-degree change, but a 4-degree change from a synthesis of the best scientific evidence available as of last year when the report was compiled. Even if that's wrong, even if we somehow miraculously reach a 2-degree limit, an article in Nature is telling us a 2-degree change will put 3.6 billion people at risk of water stress, 6 billion people at risk of heat waves, and hundreds of millions at risk of blackouts, changes in crop yields, or degradation of habitats. And that's just a 2-degree change. To say nothing of the fact that climate change could also see the complete bleaching of the world's coral reefs. That's the graph on the left. Or the graph on the right, published in the Proceedings of National Academies of Science. Global sea level rise which is just one climate impact, could cost 50 to 100 trillion per year by the end of this century. Yes, trillion, not billion. 50 to 100 trillion in damages within our lifetimes by the end of the century. So when you're confronted with that level of emergency, billions of people at risk, species going extinct. You can see at the bottom here, the landmark UN assessment of ecosystems says by the end of the century, 1 million species are at risk. In the scope of that challenge, people are now thinking, well, maybe geoengineering is the least risky option. And you see this in different stylized pathways for carbon removal. This is also from the IPCC, and you can kind of see the general thinking is that, well, emissions have to decelerate and drop very rapidly. This is deep decarbonization or aggressive mitigation. But then they have to reach zero, most commonly called net zero. But then we've got to go negative. Then we actually have to start to remove CO2 from the atmosphere to help stabilize the Earth's climatic system. In addition to doing carbon removal or carbon dioxide removal, you then have also the case that we complement it with solar radiation management, right, which can work in tandem with other interventions, including those in outer space. The National Academies had a great report last year, 2 years ago, about reflecting sunlight as well. So these options are kind of coming to the forefront of our scientific imagination about how to respond to climate change. And if you use them together, the argument is they give you a very nice approach where the carbon removal options help you stabilize emissions and the solar radiation options help reduce temperature. So we have a double solution to climate change of removing emissions and lowering temperatures at the same time. Only this collection of geoengineering options gives policymakers and inventors this flexibility in how you actually address temperature debts and emissions debts. So with that in mind, we proposed this beautiful project called Genie a few years ago. We're in year 2. It'll run for 4 more years. This shows you the entire ridiculous research agenda across, 8 work packages, 12 research questions, and 21 subtasks, which aren't actually even featured in the diagram. Again, because it's an ERC synergy grant, at least 2 PIs are involved in every task. So there's a nice way of forcing fertilization among the different team members. And you can see, I'll actually talk about a lot of these already, different assessments that span what's the state of technology, what are issues of bottlenecks and barriers, what's socially acceptable and legitimate, how well are we learning and shaping diffusion patterns, what are their risks, and what are the implications with policy. We also have a trans-meta-theoretical framework that is not rooted in any single approach. You can see at the bottom in Work Package 7, we're interested in socio-technical transitions, but also risks, but also political economy, and yes, Chen-Fei, justice is there as well. And that's transversal. It cuts across everything we do. One of the things that we've tried to do in the Genie project is take a socio-technical lens. That means we don't just look at the technology and the hardware and the infrastructure, but we also look at the social infrastructure, financing patterns, price signals, patterns of intellectual property development, broad social, ecological, political impacts, as well as really pesky issues of governance, institutionalism, equity, even weapons and weaponization and militarization, because some of these options can help control the weather and can actually be deployed in conflicts. That gets you a really complex interstitial system that looks like this, where it's not just the technology and all of these things, behaviors, policies, financing measures, knowledge communities, co-evolve. And the kind of argument is that if you only focus on one element of the system, you miss all the interactions that occur across the other dimensions of the system. So it is truly a broad socio-technical approach that refuses to separate out the technical from the social, political, cultural, and economic. Right, so with that in mind, I just wanted to kind of basket and cluster the findings from Genie so far into 3 themes. And the first one is probably the most neat. It's got lots of photographs. What are the actual technologies being pursued under this broad class of carbon removal and geoengineering. So the first one is called direct air capture. This actually shows, so part of the project involves site visits where the research team travels around the world and does rapid ethnography and does actually interviews on site. So this is my fellow Sean Lowe, went to Canada, where you can actually see Carbon Engineering's direct air capture facility. We also went to the second facility, which was Climeworks in Iceland, near Reykjavik. Both of these facilities are very interesting because they actually capture CO2 out of the air and store it safely below our feet or in the ground or in different types of repositories. So the idea is that these options, if you couple them to renewable energy or hydrogen or nuclear power or small modular reactors, could literally undo climate change. And some projections, like David Victor and colleagues, have estimated if they do become widely deployed, 80% of the future energy economy could be used just to power these devices. Luckily, they are strongly coupled with low-carbon sources of energy. This shows you the facility called Orca, which is capturing 4,000 tons per year, not the biggest amount. But this actually shows you what's looking the other way, which is the geothermal power plant operated by ON, which is providing cheap, baseload, low-carbon electricity. So again, this is a really nice coupling of direct air capture with a low-carbon energy source. One of the other biggest areas isn't DAC, but BECCS, which stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. That's me with a receding hairline in the back, standing in front of the Drax facility in the UK. This used to be the largest coal-fired power plant in Europe. It's now been retrofitted to run on bioenergy. You can see the trains that are delivering wood chips and the gasification facility there. They're in the middle of spending £2 billion to also add storage, geological storage offshore, so that it becomes a true bioenergy carbon capture and storage facility. Again, this couples together energy crops, agriculture, and forestry with carbon storage. Going even further around the world, that's my brother, and I'm taking a photo behind him in Greenland, where we went to the ice sheet, where they are actually doing ice sheet protection. And this actually involves things like removing rubble and dark materials that change the albedo of the ice sheet, which have actually accelerated the melting. And you can see we were there in the middle of winter, and already still parts of it are melting because of all of the soot and all of the kind of hot black material that absorbs high levels of radiation. Forestry is another key way in which we're storing carbon, whether it is afforestation, reforestation, or in this case, mangrove restoration. So we've done things like visit the Amazon. This is the Ecuadorian Amazon, where they're actually helping plant trees and preserve nature-based ecosystems. There's a whole variety of other nature-based solutions like seagrass restoration. This is seagrass restoration in Wales. And I'm amazed that you may not know this. Seagrass stores carbon dioxide 40 times faster than a rainforest. So just these seagrass meadows, actually, and they store it, by the way, for up to 10,000 years. So the durability and permanence of storage of seagrass restoration, because there are no wildfires under the sea, can also be very significant. On the left, it shows you a place where they're actually just getting seagrass seeds ready to be deployed on the back of that boat. And on the right is a seagrass nursery, where they're experimenting with the 72 species of seagrass to see which ones grow the best in which conditions. Another one is called macroalgae. It's a fancy way of saying seaweed. Seaweed cultivation, this one is much closer. That shows you an incubator where they're actually testing different strands of algae, and the bottom left shows you a kelp bed in the Gulf of Maine. The idea is that you can grow some of these things to store carbon. That one in the middle that I'm holding, which is green, is called ulva. Ulva is the fastest growing organism on Earth. So the mass transfer ratio is 50-1. For every 1 ton of inputs you put into algae, you can get 50 tons of carbon storage out. And that's literally why the place we visited called Running Tide is looking at deployment in the deep ocean. And you can even see here already on this graph, they are tracking carbon buoys, which are already starting to deposit carbon in the deep sea. Again, this could be scaled up really quickly. Some of those kelp carbon buoys are more than 1 kilometer long, and they will naturally sink. They're negatively buoyant, and they will sit hopefully below the ocean storing carbon for millennia. There's even more options. We got to visit the Great Barrier Reef, Maryland, where we got to look at how they're trying to protect coral reefs. That's our helicopter doing an aerial survey of the reef. That's me looking at Moore Reef, where the clownfish are. And on the left is the Australian Institute for Marine Sciences, where they're actually looking at genetic modulation of reefs to be more tolerant to heat stress, as well as looking at transplanting reef larvae to help reefs recover from cyclones, coral bleaching events, and crown of thorns starfish outbreaks. This reef protection is actually being coupled with something else, which is called marine cloud brightening, where whenever you know a heat wave is coming, you can spray vapor and mist over the Great Barrier Reef to help protect the reef from becoming too hot. This is now moving away from some of the nature-based solutions into some of the more engineered solutions. One of the other ones is called enhanced weathering. This is where you accelerate the way in which nature normally weathers or stores carbon. In this particular instance, that's a sugarcane farmer in Australia who's sprinkling basalt on his crops. You can see the basalt is in my hand, and that basalt will again store carbon for about 1,000 years, as long as it's not disrupted. And finally, and lastly, we have stratospheric aerosol injection. This is where you could fly airplanes or balloons and release particles into the atmosphere that can reflect sunlight. This is the lab at Harvard, where they're simulating aerosol dispersion in the stratosphere in that device. And this shows me next to the gondola for the Scopex experiment, which was a very controversial experiment proposed in Sweden 2 years ago, which was canceled because of concerns from the Sami that it was not respecting indigenous sovereignty. Some of these interventions are so far out, they even leave the Earth. So one of the options that we've discovered is space-based geoengineering, extraterrestrial sunshades. And you can see these have a surprisingly long history in journals like the Proceedings of the National Academies of Science and others that go back 40 or 50 years. And the idea is that you put them at the Lagrange point between the Earth and the Sun, and you can artificially dim the sun a little bit to then lower temperature change. These do sound a bit ridiculous until you realize Airbus, Space and Defense, Raytheon, Boeing, NASA, OHB, Siemens, all of them are actually researching deployment, and the cost is estimated to be only about $1 trillion. Remember what I presented earlier, $100 trillion in damages could be avoided with a $1 trillion investment in the sun shield, to say nothing of all the other benefits that you get. The moon economy, robots, Alpha Centauri sailing missions, and a whole variety of other things. And you can see a quote from one of our interviewees here. It's just a plan B airbag sort of thing. It's not meant to stay there more than 10 to 20 years. After that, it'll be removed because we can reduce our emissions. And you can see at the top this really neat quote that, well, I'd prefer to do it in outer space because we're not contaminating the Earth. And if it goes wrong, well, we can just shut it down. And it's just like the Dutch building of the dikes. That's the best analog, except in outer space. Although we do then have people who are at the bottom talking about the difficulty of doing this, as well as this one here. And I know Frank Southworth is an avid science fiction fan. There is this dictum in science fiction that anything big enough to be interesting is big enough to be oppressive. So it could also, be some future negative robotic space economy that has a whole bunch of unwanted risks. But this brief foray around the world hopefully reveals the sheer diversity of options that we've got in our disposal. And we do explore all 20 of them. And they do tend to nicely typologize. One of the ways in which you can classify them is, like I said, the more nature-based ones on the left and the more engineering ones or chemical ones on the right. That categorization works, so you could also kind of take those words out and kind of less costly on the left, more costly on the right, closer to deployment on the left, greater R&D needs on the right, however, more vulnerable to impermanence on the left, more permanent on the right. So again, starting to see different risks and trade-offs. My postdoc, Sean Lowe, had never heard of Amory Lovins before, and once he read Amory's hard and soft paths, he thought, I think we could apply that to this. So we have another paper in Global Environmental Change that looks at the hard and soft paths, taking Lovin's dichotomy, but applying it to these types of carbon removal ones where you can again see if you're going to do nature-based interventions, you can still do them the hard way. monocultures, plantations driven by industry, or the soft way, small grassroots things like community gardens from the ground up. If you're going to do industrial scale stuff that uses engineering, that can be done the hard way, much like existing power plant infrastructures, or the soft way. Marilyn and I have studied distributed resources. What about distributed capture? What if it's at playgrounds and hospitals and schools? Or what if Marilyn puts a unit on the top of her house and she can get carbon credits that go to her home for actually storing carbon? So it's kind of neat as well that, these technologies are tools and their deployment patterns can also be very distinct. A final way in which people are typologizing them is in terms of their readiness. And so some of you may have heard of these technological readiness levels, or TRLs. And again, we've worked with colleagues to help classify all the options about where they sit, and they span all of the TRLs. The early ones are very basic research in a lab. Middle ones are more like experimentation, pilot studies, and the ones further to the right are more like forestry, are much more commercialized and widespread. And this is the challenge, is that these 20 options have very different innovation dynamics, performance profiles, cost profiles, and risks. The second theme, maybe coupled nicely with that of technical diversity, is controversy. These options, as you may expect, are extremely controversial. We've done a series of different exercises to kind of reveal that controversy, one of which is we interviewed 125 experts, one of which may or may not be in this room, and we asked them questions about carbon removal and geoengineering. These are experts. These are people who have published the highest quality scientific articles or patents on the topic. And we at least did have some people who weren't at universities, although you can see a strong weight towards universities and research institutes. We still captured some views from civil society and the private sector and intergovernmental organizations. And what's interesting is when we ask these experts, what are the risks and what are the benefits? We got a whole bunch of different answers. And we actually found 107 different reasons to do and not do the options. And so from that expert exercise, 52 arguments were made in favor and 55 arguments were made against it. Slightly less than half were positive, and you can see a huge split here. 38 for carbon removal, but only 14 for solar geoengineering. So already there's a huge dissensus among the experts about, which pathway is better. And then you can also see here, more than half were negative, 31 for carbon removal and 24 for solar geoengineering. You can also see in the different colors, they transcend different dimensions. Some are technical, some are environmental, some are social. It's not just about the technology. We also did a QCA, it's qualitative case analysis, led by Sean, of 21 early stage experiments of where people tried to go outdoors, that's why it's called taking it outside, to deploy and experiment with these options, including the Scopex experiment. And you can see a whole history of ocean iron fertilization and cloud brightening and aerosols and enhanced weathering that have gone forward. And they produce very different reactions. In some cases, those reactions are so severe the projects are canceled. And we've actually went and kind of documented a kind of playbook that both opponents and proponents use to sell these interventions. One of the findings you can see here under the label of camouflage, which is just don't call it geoengineering. If you call it something else, reef recovery, salmon restoration, assisted adaptation, those things tend to make it seem more socially acceptable and legitimate than if you use that ugly word of geoengineering. To add more context to our interviews and our case study analysis, we then did a kind of quasi-expert elicitation exercise. Smaller number of experts, only 74. This was much more quantitative, where they had to fill out an instrument. And this gets even more controversy. So one of the questions we asked these experts, are negative emissions carbon removal necessary? Is solar radiation management? Look at the left. 90% plus of experts say yes, We have to do carbon removal. But 2/3 of experts say no, we don't have to do solar radiation management. We then asked all of these experts, well, what are the composite risks involved with deployment? And by risks, I mean whatever you think a risk is, whether it's technical or political, social or financial. And you can again see in this spidergram, extreme differences in risk. Some, like ecosystem restoration, are seen as having no to low risk. Same with biochar. Others, like aerosols and cloud brightening and sunshades, are seen as very, very high risk. In fact, the highest risk is aerosol injection at the bottom there, with the risk score of 10 across all of the experts. One of the other issues we asked, how fast can we deploy these efforts? And this shows you a box and whisker plot with a huge range of when our experts thought these options would each be commercialized. And the way that you read the graph is you want to go with the middle X, which you can barely see in the middle of the actual rectangle. And the dots are the outliers. It's a little hard to read, but it essentially says that only 2 options are actually available to be commercialized in the next 10 years, and that is ecosystem restoration and forestry. Unfortunately for the advocates of direct air capture, our experts said 2052. And unfortunately for our experts who talked about sunshades, it's end of the century, or pretty close to it. And this number, this graph, is just showing you the median and the mean scores. It doesn't really take into effect the number of times that our experts said never. They gave it a 0. We don't think it'll ever be commercialized. And you can see here, a whole lot of options, according to our experts, are just wishful thinking. Right? Half of them said we will never do albedo modification on buildings or ice protection. 2/3 said we won't do aerosol or cloud brightening at scale. And more than 80% said we will never do ocean fertilization, sunshades, or space-based reflectors in any meaningful way. One of the reasons, perhaps, that our experts had such strong views about why they were kind of wishing, no, I don't want it to be commercialized, is the ability for these options to create risk trade-offs. Now, Frank Southworth said I use a lot of words on my slides. This word is intentional. It's not a typo. What the heck is a risk trade-off? It's a term that usually implies you address one risk only by unleashing another dimension of risk. So you don't eliminate risk. The risk shifts. For instance, seatbelts. Seatbelts, it turns out, of course, as we all know, reduce the risk of you getting harmed in a car accident. But did you know that studies have shown that people that wear seatbelts then drive less safe? So they have more dangerous car accidents. There's a great example of a risk trade-off. You've reduced one risk and exacerbated the other. We found from our expert interview data no less than 12 risk trade-offs potentially occurring within all of our climate intervention profiles. We borrowed a framework, published an annual review that talks about how any meaningful energy transition has to affect 3 dimensions. You have the kind of institutional dimension at the top, the technological dimension in the middle, and the kind of behavioral dimension at the bottom. And we use that framework to reveal risk trade-offs across all 3 dimensions. And I won't go into all of them. That would take me a while. I'll give you an example of each. So at the top, affordability versus business potential. Affordability says we want these options to be as cheap as possible, as modular as possible, as decentralized as possible. They're built like cell phones and solar panels, not nuclear power plants. However, the cheaper they are to deploy, the less business viability there is, the less money to be made, the less regulations and all of that can be captured and converted into assets. And so the cheaper they are, the less business potential there potentially is for profits to be maximized. In the middle dimension, we only have enough land, the integrated assessment modelers tell us, for BECCS or DAC. Which one? It is physically impossible within the current parameters of development to do both. And I'll give you another example. One of our interviewees made the claim that if we were to build direct air capture in the United States at scale to offset emissions from this year, we would need more concrete than the interstate highway system. So the material intensity of these options could also be self-limiting and constraining. And finally, at the bottom, obviously, we want the options to be efficacious. That means they want them to work, right? If we're going to deploy aerosols, my gosh, we better make sure they actually reflect sunlight. And yet, the more effective they are, the more people are getting concerned that they'll actually harm themselves or the environment. It's one thing if it's just science fiction, crazy people doing stuff that will have no impact, but if it's actually working, well, then it gets into all sorts of things like, well, what's it going to do to my crops, my home, the weather, and so forth. So the more efficacious it is, the more intense the backlash can be. And then we also found not only are these risk trade-offs kind of unidimensional across these different axes, they coexist in different clusters. And so now you have risk-risk trade-offs between the dimensions. And everywhere in red, we identified key areas of where risks coalesce. And you can see like 10 of them on the diagram. And so again, I think at a minimum, it implies complex adaptive risk management for deployment. And in a worst case scenario, it implies a lot of unknown uncertainties that could compound risk rather than eliminate risk. And the final thing we did with our interview data is we were very interested in justice, especially what's called whole systems justice. And so this would be looking at not just where the technology is used, but like the mineral inputs and the resources that are needed for the technology, lithium, cobalt, copper, graphite, rare earth, where they're made, who owns them, community-based cooperatives versus transnational corporate firms, how were they transported and constructed, how is policymaking made? And then what are disposal and waste issues? So everywhere that's not gray in that box tends to be where research has not focused so much. It's usually focused on operation and use. And our interview data, because one of the questions we asked was, tell us about some of the justice impacts to deployment, also unveils a sobering array of injustices. And I'll just give you one example. I'll give you the one that most people think about doesn't fit. Transport and construction. How in the world can just building stuff lead to injustice? Well, here's some examples. For negative emissions to reach the scale required, we will need very super large continent scale managed plantations, and this would need catchment areas of thousands of square kilometers. One of our respondents said, the size of India. So we could need a space of land as big as the Indian subcontinent. There won't be any trust for deployment of these options in tribal lands. Will people actually believe it will help them, or are they going to be seen as a colonial enterprise to displace groups from their assets? Here's a final one. If you were to actually roll out CCS, you're able to maintain the current distribution of fossil fuel plants. The communities that have already been built around coal and gas will prosper, and it will probably even lead to the additional use of fossil fuels, both with things like enhanced oil recovery in the near term, and perhaps things like communities reinvesting in fossil fuels with their assets in the long term. And this leads to a whole set of whole systems justice issues, with the top showing the fact that they occur with nature-based options and the bottom showing they occur with the engineered options. And again, you can see everything from pesticide use for BECCS to resource curse risks for marginal communities to climate colonialism, to the risk of termination shocks, the fact that if we were to terminate deployment, we could create a climatic change even faster than it would have changed under current scenarios of emissions increases, to things like huge waste streams for agricultural residues, biomass, chemicals, minerals. Enhanced weathering could require mining operations that are greater than the world's coal mines. So again, the scale of the rocks and the materials and the digging and the dredging is almost unprecedented. And what's finally interesting about the justice issues is they don't just exist among the whole system, they also exist across multiple types of justice. It's not just about distributive justice, which are things like land use impacts or pollution havens or unknown risks. It's also about kind of exacerbating the vulnerability of very, very marginal groups, rural farmers, indigenous people, the chronically poor. It's about responsibility, as well as the fact of, are we actually going to still mitigate emissions if we think we can rely on these things, called mitigation deterrence, moral hazard, or capabilities. Do we want a future world in which Google and Apple own all of the world's direct air capture? I don't really trust those companies. Or should it instead be community-owned, led by grassroots organizations? And one of the final things that came out of our data was this issue of weapons and weaponization. Whether it is that some of the capabilities you need to deploy can help enhance military capabilities for satellites, aerospace, monitoring, and forecasting, or whether it is things like they could be negotiating tools. Our respondents talked about a green OPEC. If we go down bioenergy and BECS, well, couldn't the world's forestry countries band together? And then Brazil says, pay us $1 billion credits or we're going to deforest the Amazon, right? In the same way that OPEC had an embargo over oil. What about things like who controls the supply chains for the technology? Who's going to control the world's production of fertilizers for BECS, right? Or basalt for things like enhanced weathering, or lime. What about wars and physical attack? One of the first things military campaigns take out is energy infrastructure. So the next time we have a war in 30 years, are we going to target their carbon reservoirs? Are we going to target some of their DAC facilities? And what about terrorists who could take control of a carbon reservoir through their software and threaten to release 5 gigatons unless they're paid 1 million bitcoins or something? And finally, we even have in the bottom right the risk of miscalculation and counter-geoengineering, where people develop the capabilities not to use, but to counter, in the same way that the U.S. developed chemical weapons and smallpox capabilities, not with the intent to use, but the intent that someone else should use them, then we have to be ready to respond. And that could create geoengineering races, where people actually race to develop the technology. So I think, we titled this The Next Climate War, and it's just there to kind of say that these new carbon intervention technologies don't reduce the geopolitical risks of energy, they just shift it in different ways, which is another risk trade-off. Finally, we look at social acceptance and public attitudes. And so I don't see any. Does anyone in the room identify as a child? Good. Okay, thank you. We have some profane language, which is why on the next slide. So the first thing we did, we're very interested in social media, and we teamed up the Genie team with Cambridge University and Caltech to look at the Twitter discourse around geoengineering. And you can see here we found that it is a very toxic discourse that is strongly mediated with conspiracy theories and the same kind of shady actors that are actually undermining democracy. We looked at tweets across 4 different countries as well. It wasn't just the US, places like India and Sweden. And the discourse can become highly toxic. I'm not going to use the F word, but you can see F Bill Gates in the goddamn a-hole. Keep your stupid vaccines. You're criminals, right? And so there's kind of you also see stuff here to population control and conspiracies about poisoning. And you also see some people like John Holdren mentioned who are like respectable scientists who are wrongly, this is misinformation, look at this. John Holdren admits that they are geoengineering the planet. That explains the constant chemical bombardment. So again, these are very dark narratives being perpetuated on different social media platforms. Chemtrails. That's right. One of the other things that we found is that a lot of the social acceptance literature has problems in terms of technology coverage and country coverage. So one of the things that I really, really like is this term weird countries. Western, educated, industrialized, rich democracies. There's a great article published in Nature 10 years ago called Most of the World is Not Weird. 87% of our research is based in weird countries that are in 12% of the population. So we need a lot more work of countries that are not Western, educated, rich, industrialized democracies. If any of you watch PBS NewsHour, you may have seen 2 days ago the story that India is now the most populous country in the world. They overtook China. And now that I think 60% of the world's population is in 2 countries, neither of which are weird, Western, industrialized, rich democracies. And yet you can see here, when we looked at the social acceptance literature on carbon removal, it is almost entirely Australia, the US, Germany, and Europe, with just 1 study of China and 1 study of India. So again, huge biases in the research. You can also see the research designs tend to cluster with very few technologies. You can see a clustering, the most is 6, and also a small number of countries. The most is 6. And either of them were 6 and 6. The ones that had 6 countries were 1 or 2 technologies, and the one that had 6 technologies were only 2 to 4 countries. So we were like, well, that's kind of problematic as well. The kind of scope for understanding public attitudes goes well beyond just 4 or 6 technologies and 4 or 6 countries. Especially when, this is from Marilyn Brown's excellent book with MIT Press, you have deployment as a portfolio, where you don't have 2, 6, or 10, but 20 options deployed as part of a kind of policy mix, where you can see on the bottom all the carbon removal options and on the top all the solar radiation management options. And in the same way that our energy supply systems are heavily diversified, we've got landfill gas capture and wind and solar and coal and nuclear and hydro. We'll probably have a same portfolio or cocktail of deployment with true climate protection measures if they do come to be deployed. We're all in. And yet we have never studied that sort of complex interaction before in the literature. So we decided it's what we're now doing, now that we've already finished analyzing the interviews and done the expert elicitation, is we're doing a very large-scale survey where we're focusing on 10 interventions. 20 was too much. 10, and in fact, those 10 are then broken into 3 groups because we didn't want respondents to have to deal with all 10. So on the left, you can see we've chosen the solar radiation management technologies of aerosols, cloud brightening, and space. 3 very different options, and we did design those diagrams, by the way. In the middle, you have your nature-based carbon removal. So that's forestry, soils, and marine biomass and blue carbon. That's the oceans, ocean CDR. And then finally on the right, you have engineered CDR, which is DAC, BECCS, weathering, and biochar. So a pretty good list of kind of the top contenders for climate protection. Each group in the survey was only assigned 1 set of technologies. So they spent 30 to 45 minutes on the survey, but only having to deal with 1 of the 3, which really helped. And we also had a lot of checks on knowledge, where they had to spend 3 minutes reading our introductory material, and then we quizzed them on it. We had 6 knowledge checks in the survey as well, and 2 retention checks. A retention check in a survey is where it says, please click this box. If you don't click that box, you're kicked out of the survey. Right, so we really made sure that people were aware and participatory. And because we're very well funded, and because we really wanted to address the shortcomings in the literature, we decided to run it in 30 countries, coupled with 44 focus groups in 22 countries. And again, we really did try to go to a lot of non-weird countries: Chile, Brazil, Kenya, Nigeria, South Africa, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, India, China, Singapore, as well as places like Dominican Republic, which you can see, I think, you can see it right below the US. And the survey design was very, I think, well designed. Chad Baum gets credit for how we designed the survey. You can see, we had the randomized assignment to one of those 3 technology groups, and then we asked them about their familiarity and knowledge. We asked them about their perceptions of risks and benefits, also known as stance detections, support, oppose. We then asked them which technologies they preferred. We asked them about policies, according to a typology of policies, which included moratoriums and bans. There's even efforts now with colleagues like Frank Bierman and Jenny Stevens who've talked about putting a ban on geoengineering research. We wanted to see what do people think about it. We have a lot of really good covariates, like, are they impacted by a climate disaster? Do they believe climate change is caused by humans? Do they adopt an EV? Do they have solar on their home? Because we think those things may have really strong predictive power that people who are pro the environment may also be pro or against a lot of these options. And then we also had a lot of demographic questions, some of which I'm kind of amazed we got ethics approval for. Political views, religiosity, and ethnic minority status. So we were able to get into our survey, what are their political views, liberal, conservative, Democrat, etc. How religious are they? And whether they self-identified as a member of an indigenous group, an ethnic minority, or what race they were. And because survey data is good and rich, but it's an instrument, we also then coupled it with qualitative focus groups. In 22 of the countries, we didn't have the capabilities to do all 30 because some of those countries do not have networks for focus groups set up. And you can see this was structured a little bit differently because they're in person and they go quicker. But it was after a warm-up, again, the core: risks, benefits, actors, and different types of governance things, risks and benefits and policies. And then a final thing we didn't do in the survey, because it's very open-ended, we had them create imagined futures, where we said, imagine a headline about one of the technologies in 2030, and what is that headline? So my research team is now navigating through the 600 different futures that our respondents created. I can tell you already, preliminarily, this shows you the first paper that we've got under review as of 2 weeks ago at Nature Climate Change, which gave us extremely surprising results. The headline is, countries in the Global South, contrary to what a lot of Global North scholars have said, countries in the Global South are more familiar with these options, want deployment more, are less restrictive on policy, and are more supportive of experiments. So this is fascinating because a lot of Global South commentators have kind of argued we shouldn't do these options because people are against them. Well, now our evidence base is showing extremely rigorously, because our survey was nationally representative for age, gender, location, and class, and we did the survey in 19 languages. We have pretty robust results that actually a lot of people in the Global South really want these technologies, and they even want them more than participants places like the US or the Global North. This is the beauty of doing open-ended research. We didn't know what we would find until we actually ran the survey. Final thing we want to do, and this is my last slide, is we do want to kind of create more impact. And so I think it's we're creating a Genie Knowledge Hub that EASA is running with a Scenarios Explorer where you can actually tweak different scenarios of net zero deployment. We're trying to gather evidence and increase the knowledge base that can kind of shape these discussions in a neutral way. You have a lot of people who are for or against these options. We try to be neither. We just try to assess the benefits, assess the risks, have good research designs that collect data dispassionately and in a nonpartisan way. And we want to kind of shape future deployment pathways through policy. And I'm really delighted that already this year we've been featured in Nature, The Economist, The Washington Post, and Time Magazine with some of our research. And so I think, we want to also keep spreading the word. And so I'll end there. Thank you.
So we've got time for lots of questions, but I'm going to take the executive authority to ask the first question. So you kind of highlighted that there were these space-based approaches and there were the Earth-based approaches. And I found it interesting that the scientists that were studying the space-based were pointing out that they're less worried about it because we'd like to experiment in space rather than experiment on the Earth. But it certainly feels like there's more apprehension about that type of stuff than there is the forestry and the soil carbon capture and those types of approaches. So is it that the public and the scientists have a bit of a disconnect there in terms of the risk? Is that perception correct, and that the public is generally more happy to do the earthbound types of responses versus the scientists are more likely to go to space?
It's a very good question. Yes and no. So from memory, and I should check the survey results, I do recall that space-based efforts are the least preferred across the survey. So of all 10 options, it's like that's the one people are least comfortable with. Although there are variations. It's some countries like Japan love them, because it's high tech and it could help catalyze the space economy. And countries in sub-Saharan Africa are also thinking about these options because they're going to be maybe the most severely hit by climate change. And they also want to develop aerospace capabilities and space launch capabilities. I will say that you've had some respondents who are so supportive of space-based efforts that they're very elegant at making claims that actually do resonate with some people, that people find acceptable. One of which is that a lot of things like aerosols and even genetically modified crops, say for BECS, are out of our control. But if a sunshade is causing problems, we just turn it off. So it's reversible and controllable. And one of the other things that they kind of said is that we had a question in our interview protocol about the Sustainable Development Goals. And the space-based people were able to give some of the best answers. And many times those answers were, what SDGs does it benefit? All of them. And they would go line by line, here's how it helps with hunger and with life above land and life below water. So I think they're kind of starting to get more articulative narratives behind space-based stuff. That said, the paper that we did on space, and I got to give Chad Baum credit. It's called Between the Sun and Us is the subtitle. We go through risks and benefits, and the risks do seem to outweigh the benefits for the moment. One of them that I remember is if we were to launch that sun shield, first of all, it's going to be like the size of Texas. It's going to be massive. Secondly, it would require more space launches than we've ever done combined. Like, take the history of space, and we need more just to get the materials up to the moon where you can then launch it to where we go to the Lagrange point. So I think once you start to hear those types of difficulties, I don't think it's that feasible in the near term. But the public does seem mostly against it for now. But we'll see how effective these narratives are at overcoming that.
And you just kind of brought up my second question. So when you're asking people how ready for prime time are these technologies, when do you think they're going to be deployed? How do you all check for strategic responses among your survey respondents? Right? Certainly, some of them have skin in the game here and have a certain technology that they would benefit from using, and are worried that perhaps being truthful might undercut support for the research that they're doing, or for a technology that they happen to be championing and getting behind.
So in the kind of quasi-expert elicitation, I say quasi because it wasn't a pure expert elicitation design where we had people come together at a workshop over days. It was an expert elicitation done with a survey instrument. That was far more pessimistic of the technology. Like, there's kind of often a bias in expert elicitation of where they're optimistic. Like small modular reactors, solar energy, EVs, and shale gas are all examples where the experts actually were too high. They were too optimistic about deployment. And we were kind of like, this is interesting because our experts on PAR seem on the most part negative and cautious. We tried to hedge gaming of the responses in 3 ways. First, we invited people for and against the technologies. So it wasn't like just we went to the advocates. We also went to people like Alan Robach is extremely critical of SAI. We also went to David Keith, who's extremely for it. So in theory, Robach and Keith will even each other out as they're giving the numbers. The second thing we did is we wanted to make sure we had a very large sample of experts. That's why we didn't just have 20 or 30 like you do in a lot of expert elicitations. We had 70 to 125. So that way, anyone's ability to game is reduced by the other 124 respondents. And the third thing we did is we also tried, we didn't succeed, we tried to arrange input from not just research, but 3 other sectors, civil society, the private sector, and government, which in theory would all help, like a critical stakeholder assessment, for and against, and a large number of interviews, at least tries to hedge the ability to game. And we fully report all the data. So all of our papers have the full data tables in the appendix. And you can see with the expert elicitation paper, we still gave you the ones who said never. So you can kind of see, in addition to those who were really optimistic. So I think we did the best we could. But this is a weakness with qualitative methods. People can give you an answer that they want to give for a variety of reasons.
I was going to say, somebody should ask a question, or I'm going to talk to Benjamin all day. Marilyn bailed everyone out.
Hey, Benjamin. Wonderful presentation. We've talked about the choice between mitigation, adaptation, and geoengineering from a couple of dimensions. We usually talk about who's going to benefit, how near are the benefits to the locality of the investment. We talk about the speed of return on investment. Is it near term, far term? What is the potential for retrieval of your costs? And along those dimensions, mitigation usually wins, except for the nearness. That's adaptation. Adaptation means you can protect your own turf. For carbon removal, I think it loses on most of those dimensions. So I'm wondering if, for instance, the Global South is happy to see investment in carbon removal because the North will pay for it all, because they obviously can't. I'm wondering, what is the hold that you have that you think can be used to energize enthusiasm for carbon removal globally in the near term?
Thank you, Marilyn. So we did one paper on direct air capture only, which was 10 policy recommendations. And that gets into kind of all the governance dynamics of if you were to try to create the perfect policy mix to get DAC used, the first thing's a price on carbon, right? That's number one. Number two is good monitoring, verification. So we kind of have a whole list of like, well, if you're going to do it, make sure you do it this way or else it probably won't happen. Restrict enhanced oil recovery. Separate out your negative emissions targets from mitigation targets. That'll help hedge mitigation deterrents, and so forth. I think that's probably how you would do it. I didn't show you the expert elicitation exercise also asked people what price on carbon did they think these options needed. Soils, ecosystem management, and forestry are all less than 50 a ton. DAC, direct air capture, was above 200. It's actually 200 to 500. And some options are above 1,000. So it's kind of like, according to the experts, it's like, well, if we were ever to do that, the market's got to change so much that we're maybe not even talking avoided cost of carbon, we're talking the damage cost. And it's factored in now, or else they won't happen. Final thing I'll say is that there was a split in our expert responses about business models, because we did ask kind of, is there a business model for CDR, negative emissions? And most people did say yes, although it tends to be coupled to other business models, like DAC is coupled to energy supply, and BECCS and biochar are captured with agriculture and soils and soil treatments and amendments and all of that. So it's kind of like their business models get mingled. Most of our respondents, though, said that there was no business model for solar radiation management. That has to be done by governments, and governments only. Or, in our weapons paper, was a small little blurry box, there's a concern of a green finger. Not Goldfinger, James Bond, the villain, but a green finger in Elon Musk, Bill Gates, who decides, well, it's just $1 billion, I'll deploy. And so that's another situation of where, billionaires and governments seems to be the only space in which you'll see a lot of those techniques used. There is no, it's a public good, temperature. Or people who just want to control temperature. And this is a very scary situation of Pakistan and India are now in a conflict. What if Pakistan wants to control India's weather and accelerate the monsoon where they could deploy aerosols or cloud brightening? And so they're all kind of geopolitical issues as well that get to rise. But again, none of this is a business model. These are military government uses. So I think that may hold true for the dichotomy between the options.
I actually have the microphone, so
Take it, David.
again, thanks for this talk. It's really, really mind-blowing in a way. And I think one of the things maybe people find makes them uneasy about this is that we're used to the paradigm of externalities and pollution, and in a sense we're trying to restrict those and restore a natural state, right? And this very much opens up the question of, well, we can control the climate. What do you want it to be? What should it be? And then all the kinds of conflicts and differences of stakeholders as to what that might be. What do you think about that? I mean, you could look at this the same way we look at mitigation, which is, well, we're just trying to get back to some baseline temperature. But it also seems to me that, well, if you're controlling the sunlight and you're going to control the albedo and you're going to change the composition of the atmosphere, why not optimize it somehow?
Yeah. Very good question, David. I mean, I think it depends on where. So there are great regional variations, for instance. I guess it's easier to do aerosol injection at the poles because it's easier to get up there and the aerosols stay up there longer, where you can't do it so well at the tropics. There's also a lot of talk about like cloud brightening only over coral reefs. So it's kind of like it would be regionally deployed, but you wouldn't do them in Alaska. You wouldn't do those sorts of things, over land here in Tennessee or in Atlanta. So I think there are some kind of different parameters that shape technology deployment. But yeah, I mean, there is an irony here that we're using technology to undo a problem caused largely by technology. And there's a whole lot of hubris as well. I didn't present it, but Sean Lowe went through our interview data, and we have another piece called Undone Science about the process of science making in these efforts and just how social it is, how it's like, it's not that there isn't good science, but it's just that science is being shaped very strongly by different norms, different financing patterns. The Inflation Reduction Act has really kind of catalyzed a new revolution almost in a lot of these options. And then finally, if you take a step back from our preliminary findings so far with the case studies, the interviews, the expert elicitation, and even the weapons work, it does seem you've got kind of three different classes of technology. The lowest risk, cheapest, most socially acceptable ones, soil management, ecosystem restoration, and forestry, with maybe biochar. Those are probably good. Those, David, are probably going to do for a variety of other reasons, maybe for adaptation and mitigation, but they also, it's like they do everything. You know, I just read a study on seagrass. It's like got 40 co-benefits. Fisheries, coastal resilience, water, it helps purify water, helps reduce sedimentation. It's like this goes on and on and on and on. So I think those kind of class, yes, we'll do those. And we've been doing lots of them like forestry for at least a century. You got these in the middle, like direct air capture and BECCS and enhanced weathering, where it's kind of like, depends how we design them, right? Are they going to go the way of wind and solar, or the way of maybe nuclear power, CCS, you know, big hydro? I don't know. And then we finally have the ones like aerosols and space. We're like, no, no. I think that's probably where the evidence stands now across those three.
Fascinating, because there was a paper that just came out the other day that was talking about how the co-benefits piece really only gets captured by companies that are vertically integrated. And so this is getting back to the business model piece. And so the more vertically integrated you are, the better you can capture those co-benefits. But they were documenting how, since the turn of the century, vertically integrated companies have become more and more scarce. And one of the reasons was climate change. That vertically integrated used to mean that you owned the land that produced whatever input you wanted, and that was becoming riskier and riskier. And so they were offshooting those companies and selling them off, which I found interesting from a business model perspective, that climate change may actually be undercutting the ability to capture some of those co-benefits.
And I think it was one of those risk diagrams. Deployment of one option could interfere with other options. And so a really good example of if we deploy the sun shield and we lower incoming solar radiation by 5%, what about all our forecasts for solar photovoltaics and CSP? So now we're blunting one of our best mitigation instruments, right? Or what about the photosynthesis of plants, which have adapted to sunlight? So it's kind of like, okay, we did one thing, but then it's creating all these other risks later on. So it could even be worse, like we shoot ourselves in the foot or the head with some of these options.
So great research, great presentation. I think of the climate problem in several ways, and one of them is that there is the knowledge problem, where that's where you will come in, spend a lot of time, energy, research, traveling, doing all this great research. The other dimension is what I call policymakers' readiness, and sometimes even our own readiness to accept evidence-based work. So I just want to pick your thoughts on, based on your own experiences, field experiences, professional experiences. Where would you place policymakers, the people who really call the shots? How do you gauge their readiness to accept, some of these incredible ideas that we're seeing from your research as well as research from other people? Because at the end of the day, we need to get the buy-in of such people, because they have legitimate authority to make decisions that can help deploy the ideas in this kind of research to help address the climate crisis.
Yeah, excellent question. I just gave you my answer to David about the kind of viability of ranking the options, and I think policy is not following that rank order, right? You don't see the Inflation Reduction Act really focused on soils and and biochar and other things and forestry. We're not planting 1 billion trees here, even though Saudi Arabia has tried to do that. It's like we don't have those types of massive programs that I'm aware of yet for the US. So in my mind, it really does seem like policymakers are in that middle area of the engineered carbon removal. So direct air capture, BECCS, maybe some enhanced weathering, and definitely some of the more high-tech seaweed cultivation, seagrass restoration. The world's most effective seagrass restoration program is actually off the coast of Virginia. And when we did all that stuff on seaweed, that's Running Tide, which is in Maine, with a Dartmouth engineer who's now a finalist for the X Prize or whatever prize. So it's kind of like, this is American innovation behind a lot of it. But I think policy has been captured, for better or for worse, by this really wonderful narrative. Isn't it great if we can get emissions out of the atmosphere and put them below ground? And so anything that's involving carbon capture and storage seems to be very strongly incentivized. The Inflation Reduction Act has lots of regulations for it. I do follow market trends for direct air capture. Carbon Engineering and Climeworks, who are the two leaders, have closed down facilities in Europe and are moving them to the US because of the incentives. So I think in that regard, it's not too surprising because it's a great narrative. For better or for worse, we're kind of going with the high-tech approach, and we've done this before. Some of the work that I did in my PhD looked at the history of American wind research, so R&D on wind turbines, which we didn't do well. We started big in the 70s with aerospace companies from the top down and were beat by Denmark, which was bottom-up bricolage from farmers experimenting with small turbines that scaled up. And now Denmark is the undisputed king of the wind turbine market with Vestas, Bonus, Siemens, and all of that still located there. So it's kind of like we did this kind of high-tech approach before and it didn't work, but we keep doing it's kind of the American way, right? That's how we do it. Capitalism, competition, companies. And I think that's worrying. And that seems to be where most of the policy discourse is. And it's interesting that Europe, when the US passed the Inflation Reduction Act, their response wasn't, we're going to keep doing forestry. It was, oh my gosh, we got to follow them. So now Europe is now creating incentives that are mirroring a lot of what we're doing here. So I do think that the hottest three options are BECS, DAC, and CCS in the policy communities, among policymakers. I was even just at a meeting in the city of Boston, where Boston had a discussion about, should we do direct air capture in the city? Right? So, city policymakers who don't even know probably what direct air capture is in detail are thinking about it already.
But I guess that just implies fossil fuels can continue to coexist in this world if we achieve those technologies, which is very appealing to most of the political resistance that's been there in the past, I would imagine.
And it couples really well with some of the problems with renewables like wind energy. If it's producing it at night, well, that can power a DAC facility, right? So it also integrates well with where we're trying to invest. There's a huge offshore wind push on the East Coast. Also down here in Georgia, Tennessee, a bit.
So I have something supportive to share and then a question. On your risk construct, I'm familiar with the sporting and extreme sports sort of take on that. An enthusiast risk taker, their risk taking will expand in relation to the protection offered. So, example, my son, thank you for the ski helmet, Dad. I can go faster and through tighter trees now. So the question is about if we use green energy for carbon capture, I see an opportunity cost. Would it not be better to use the green energy to offset the remaining carbon emission?
Yes, and there's a great debate in the community about this. In the justice paper that I presented, this is the beauty of interviews. We have phenomenal quotes. And one of the quotes, I can't tell you who it's from because we keep all of our quotes respondents though, said that these options that I just presented are the fleas and lice of decarbonization policy. They're all the unwanted things that we don't want, the pests that are infecting us as we try to go to carbon and are distracting us from what we need to do, which is efficiency, renewables, decarbonization now. That's proven. Right, and so I think that's a legitimate claim. It's like a lot of the stuff, it's especially if you buy our experts who are saying it's not going to be here till 2050, 2060, that's too late. We've got 10 years, which takes a lot of these options completely off the table. And isn't it better just to put more money into load management, demand response, CHP, green parks, planting trees? And so I do think that that's a fair point, and it does come out of our literature. The two terms that are used a lot are moral hazard and mitigation deterrence. And some very good political scientists have really shown how once policymakers think that we can do this, it ruins your climate policy because this becomes the default option. And we have to just be very, very careful about that.
So we talked about Greenfinger a second ago. I want to put in a plug. On Thursday, we will have Mike Boots here. Mike is the Executive Vice President of Breakthrough Energy. What is Breakthrough Energy? It's Bill Gates' clean energy arm, right? So it's the clean energy arm of the Bill Gates Foundation. He's going to be here talking a little bit about some of the solutions that we talked about today. Their job is essentially to figure out how to bridge this gap between the technology and then getting it deployed. And so he's going to be talking a little bit about the new technologies he's excited about, what are the things that are getting in the way, and then where are places where researchers here on campus can potentially get involved with some of the initiatives that's going on at the Gates Foundation. So put that on your calendar. That'll be this Thursday at 5 o'clock. And then join me one more time in thanking Benjamin for coming and giving a great talk today.